Have you ever felt the kind of fear that makes the hairs on your neck stand straight? The kind where your heart pounds so hard it drowns out every other sound? I've heard a lot of stories, but what I'm about to share with you tonight, these aren't just tales someone dreamed up to give you a scare. No, these are real accounts, things that people swear they experienced. And if even half of what they said is true, you're in for a very long, sleepless night. As I tell you these stories, I want you to picture them. Imagine you're the one driving down that lonely road or staying in that cursed hotel. These are warnings, reminders that not everything in this world can be explained. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll be questioning every creak, every shadow, and every unexplained sound in your house. Let's begin. Story 1, The Black-Eyed Children. Let me take you back to one of the most terrifying nights of my life. This happened a few years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was driving home after visiting a friend. The route I take is usually busy during the day, but at night, it feels like a completely different world, empty, dark, and almost lifeless. The road stretched out before me, with tall trees on either side casting shadows that danced in the glow of my headlights. There were no other cars around, no streetlights, just the sound of my tires on the pavement and the occasional rustling of leaves. I kept glancing at the clock, eager to get home and collapse into bed. But then, out of nowhere, I saw them. Two kids, standing under a broken street lamp. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I mean, what were two kids doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? I slowed down, my car crawling closer to where they stood. They weren't moving. Just standing there, side by side, like statues. The boy raised his arm, his hand lifting in a slow, deliberate wave, signaling for me to stop. I'll admit, my first instinct was to pull over and help. They were just kids, after all. Maybe they were lost or stranded. But as I got closer, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air around them seemed heavier, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the eerie silence of the night, it was something more, something unnatural. I stopped a few feet away and rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. The boy stepped forward, and that's when I noticed his clothes. They looked old-fashioned, like something from a different era. A plain button-up shirt, suspenders, and pants that were slightly too short. The girl, who stayed behind, was wearing a simple dress that reminded me of those black and white photos you'd see in history books. The boy spoke, and his voice sent chills down my spine. "Can you give us a ride?" It was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. He didn't sound scared or grateful, just empty. I glanced at the girl. She hadn't moved a muscle. Her head was tilted downward, her hair hiding most of her face. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, so tight that I could see the whiteness of her knuckles even in the dim light. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, hoping for some clarity. The boy didn't answer my question. Instead, he repeated himself. "We need a ride. Let us in." That's when the dread hit me. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to lock the doors and drive away. But I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at these kids who didn't seem quite right. Then, the girl moved. Slowly, she lifted her head, and I swear to you, what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Her eyes. They were black. Completely black. No whites, no pupils, just two dark voids staring back at me. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could react, the boy stepped closer, his face now illuminated by my headlights. His eyes were the same. Pitch black, as if someone had erased the very soul from them. I slammed my foot on the gas, my tires screeching as I sped away. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept driving, my eyes glued to the road, praying I'd make it home. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, replaying what I'd just seen. I convinced myself it was some kind of prank, that maybe my exhaustion was making me see things. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked every door and window in my house. I even left the lights on, something I never do. But it didn't help. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft tapping on my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. Tap. 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 It didn't stop. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The next morning, I checked the window, hoping to find some logical explanation, a tree branch, maybe. But there was nothing there. For weeks, the tapping continued. Always at the same time, always the same rhythm. I never saw them again, but I didn't have to. Their faces, those black, empty eyes, were burned into my memory. I don't stop for strangers anymore. No matter how helpless they look, no matter how innocent they seem. Because now I know. Some things aren't human. And some things are best left alone. If you're feeling a chill running down your spine right now, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any more of these terrifying tales. Story 2, The Silent Forest. Let me take you on another journey, one that still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. This story isn't just about fear, it's about the kind of dread that sticks with you, long after you've left the place where it all happened. I wasn't alone this time, I was with a group of friends, and that night, we learned the hard way that there are some places you're just not meant to go. It was a weekend trip, meant to be a quick escape from the chaos of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, me, James, Lisa, Sarah, and Mark, and we'd heard about this hiking trail deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be breathtaking, with a view at the summit that would make the hours of hiking worth it. The locals warned us about the forest on the way, though. They said it was known as the Silent Forest, and for good reason. You won't hear birds. You won't hear insects. Not even the wind, one old man told us at a nearby gas station. His voice was calm, but his eyes looked distant, as if he was remembering something he didn't want to share. If you hear whispers, leave. Don't look back. We laughed it off, of course. We were young, confident, and looking for adventure. The idea of a silent forest sounded more intriguing than frightening. So, armed with flashlights, snacks, and our phones, we set out in high spirits. At first, it seemed like any other forest, tall trees stretching toward the sky, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, and we joked and chatted as we walked. But the deeper we went, the quieter it became. The change was subtle at first. The distant chirping of birds faded away, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Even the crunch of our boots on the dirt trail seemed muffled. Lisa was the first to notice. "Is it just me, or is it too quiet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all stopped, standing in a circle and listening. She was right. There was no sound. No rustling leaves, no buzzing insects, nothing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. James tried to lighten the mood. "Guess the wildlife's on vacation," he said with a chuckle, but no one laughed. We pressed on, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The trail became harder to follow, with roots and rocks jutting out as if trying to trip us. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks twisting in unnatural ways. That's when we started hearing the whispers. At first, they were faint, so faint that I thought I was imagining them. A soft, indistinct murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, Mark froze. "Wait," he said, holding up his hand. We all stopped, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. And then we heard it clearly, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling Mark's name. "Mark." It was so soft, almost gentle, but it made my blood run cold. Mark's face went pale. That's my mom's voice," he whispered. His mom had passed away 2 years ago. None of us knew what to say. We just stood there, staring at him, until the voice came again. "Mark, come here." This time, it was louder, coming from deeper in the forest. Mark took a step toward the sound, but James grabbed his arm. "No," James said firmly. "We're sticking together." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just Mark's name anymore. They were calling all of us. Lisa, Sarah, James, even me. Each voice sounded different, familiar, like someone we knew and loved. "It's not real," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "It's just some weird echo or something." We decided to turn back. The hike wasn't worth it anymore, we just wanted to get out. But the trail was different now. The path we'd followed so easily before seemed to twist and split in ways that didn't make sense. "This isn't right," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "This isn't the way we came." Then, we saw the carvings. Strange symbols etched into the trees, deep and jagged, as if made with claws. At first, they were sporadic, but soon they were on every tree we passed. And the whispers, they were everywhere now, overlapping and growing louder, until it felt like the forest itself was alive, surrounding us, watching us. We started running, panic taking over. The trail seemed to shift beneath our feet, leading us in circles. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural laughter that didn't sound human. And then, one by one, the shadows appeared. At first, they were just shapes, blending into the trees. But as they got closer, their forms became clearer, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and hollow faces. Their eyes were empty sockets, yet I could feel them watching us. They didn't move, but every time we looked away, they were closer. We lost Sarah first. She was at the back of the group, and when we turned to check on her, she was gone. No scream, no sound, just gone. "Sarah!" Lisa screamed, her voice echoing through the silence, but there was no answer. James tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal. None of ours did. It was as if the forest had swallowed us whole, cutting us off from the rest of the world. "We have to keep moving," Mark said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." We didn't make it out until sunrise. Somehow, we found the trail again, though none of us could say how. When we reached the edge of the forest, we collapsed in exhaustion, our bodies aching and our minds reeling. Sarah was never found. We reported her disappearance to the authorities, but they said there was no trace of her in the forest. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that forest. The locals call it cursed, and now I understand why. It's not just the silence. It's the feeling that something is watching, waiting, and once you enter, it never really lets you go. If you're feeling a chill running down your spine right now, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any more of these terrifying tales. Story 3, The Roommate. This next story is one that still haunts me. It's not just because of what happened, but because it involved someone I thought I knew, someone I trusted. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the dark, they're the ones living right next to you. It all started when I moved to a new city for a job. I didn't know anyone there, and renting an apartment on my own was out of my budget, so I decided to look for a roommate. I posted an ad online, and within a day, I got a reply from someone named Brian. Brian seemed normal, friendly, even. He was in his late 20s, like me, worked as a graphic designer, and claimed he was quiet and neat. We met at a coffee shop, and he seemed harmless, maybe a little shy, but nothing unusual. I figured, why not? We signed the lease together, and within a week, we were both moved in. At first, everything was fine. Brian kept to himself most of the time, spending hours in his room with his computer. He wasn't much of a talker, but he paid his share of the rent on time, and he didn't throw any wild parties or leave dishes in the sink. Honestly, I thought I'd hit the jackpot in the roommate lottery. But then, little things started to bother me. It was nothing major at first, just odd quirks. For example, Brian never ate with me or in the kitchen. I'd see him bring groceries into the apartment, but he always ate in his room. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear him talking to himself. Not just mumbling, full conversations. I figured he was on the phone or gaming online, so I didn't think much of it. Then came the locks. One day, I came home to find that Brian had installed a lock on his bedroom door. Not a normal one, but one of those heavy-duty deadbolts. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, just for security. I thought it was weird, but it was his room, so I didn't push it. Things got stranger after that. I started noticing strange smells coming from his room. At first, it was faint, just a musty, sour odor that I assumed was dirty laundry. But it got worse, and soon it was so bad that it seeped into the hallway. I brought it up once, jokingly asking if something had died in there. Brian just laughed it off and said he'd clean up soon. But he didn't. If anything, the smell got worse. One night, I decided to knock on his door to confront him about it. I knocked once. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Brian, are you in there? I called. I heard movement, soft, shuffling footsteps, but he didn't open the door. I'm busy, he said from the other side, his voice low and almost irritated. I'll take care of it later. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the smell, about the weird noises I'd heard late at night, scraping sounds, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I decided I needed to know what was going on. The next day, while Brian was at work, I tried to get into his room. I know it wasn't right, I felt guilty even as I did it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The door was locked, of course, but I noticed that the frame was slightly loose. With a bit of force, I managed to pop the lock. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The room was a mess, papers and garbage strewn everywhere, the walls covered in strange, obsessive drawings. But it was the smell that hit me first. It was overwhelming, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. In the corner of the room was a small refrigerator, and next to it was a metal table with what looked like surgical tools. And then I saw it. On the table was a jar filled with something. At first, I thought it was some kind of strange art project, but as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. It was flesh. Pieces of raw, bloody flesh suspended in liquid. I stumbled back, gagging, my mind racing. What the hell was Brian doing in here? I didn't have time to think. I heard the front door open. Brian was home. Panic set in as I quickly tried to fix the lock and make it look like I hadn't been in his room. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend, telling them to call me in 5 minutes and pretend it was an emergency. I needed an excuse to leave. Brian didn't say anything when he saw me in the living room. He just nodded, dropped his bag, and went straight to his room. But before he closed the door, he looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. It wasn't anger or suspicion. It was emptiness. Like he wasn't really there. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, listening, and sure enough, the noises started again. Scraping, dragging, and something else, something wet, like the sound of meat being cut. I knew I couldn't stay there. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't even tell Brian. I just left and called the landlord, telling him I was breaking the lease. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about Brian. He'd been arrested after a neighbor reported more strange smells coming from the apartment. When the police searched his room, they found more jars, dozens of them, each containing human remains. Brian wasn't just my roommate. He was a killer. And to this day, I can't believe how close I came to becoming one of his victims. If you're feeling a chill running down your spine right now, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any more of these terrifying tales. Story 4, The Haunted Hotel. This next story takes me back to a trip I'll never forget, a trip that changed the way I think about hotels forever. To this day, I'm not sure if I was imagining things or if I really experienced something beyond explanation. Whatever it was, it still gives me chills. I was traveling for work and had booked a room in a small, out-of-the-way hotel. It wasn't one of those big chains, just a quaint, family-owned place that seemed charming in the pictures. The online reviews were mixed, but I didn't pay much attention to them. I just needed a place to sleep for a couple of nights. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet the place was. Too quiet. There were no cars in the parking lot, no other guests in sight. Even the receptionist seemed surprised to see me. She was an older woman, probably in her 60s, and she kept glancing over my shoulder like she was expecting someone else. When I asked her if they were fully booked, she hesitated before saying, "No, you'll be the only guest tonight." I laughed it off, joking about how I'd have the place to myself. But she didn't laugh. Instead, she handed me the key and said, "Room 207. Don't open the wardrobe." Her words caught me off guard. "Excuse me?" I asked, thinking I must have misheard her. "Enjoy your stay," she said quickly, avoiding eye contact. I brushed it off as her being quirky and made my way to the room. The hallway leading to room 207 felt longer than it should have, and with every step, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white pictures of people who looked like they belonged in a different century. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by. When I finally reached the room, I hesitated before unlocking the door. I don't know why, but something about it felt wrong. The brass numbers on the door looked tarnished, like they'd been there for decades, and the key turned with a creak that echoed down the hallway. The room itself was small but cozy. A single bed, a desk, and, of course, a wardrobe, the old-fashioned kind with carved wooden doors and a full-length mirror in the center. It looked like something out of a Victorian-era movie, and I immediately thought back to the receptionist's strange warning. "Don't open the wardrobe." I laughed to myself, thinking she was just trying to mess with me. Still, there was something about that wardrobe that made me uneasy. It stood there, dominating the room, as if it were watching me. I decided to ignore it. I unpacked my bag, grabbed my laptop, and tried to settle in for the night. But the longer I stayed in that room, the more uncomfortable I felt. The air was heavy, and no matter how high I turned the thermostat, the room stayed cold. Then came the noises. At first, it was faint, just a soft creaking sound, like wood shifting under pressure. I figured it was the old building settling and tried to ignore it. But the creaking grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded like footsteps pacing just outside my door. I got up to check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, closed the door, and locked it. But the moment I turned around, I noticed something strange. The wardrobe door was slightly open. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. I knew I hadn't touched it, and there was no way it could have opened on its own. Slowly, I walked toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the wardrobe, I hesitated, remembering the receptionist's warning. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the door open, and inside was nothing. Just empty wooden shelves and a faint smell of mothballs. I let out a nervous laugh, feeling silly for getting worked up over nothing. But as I turned to close the door, I noticed something in the mirror. A shadow. It was faint, barely there, but it moved. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. My heart was pounding as I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone. I closed the wardrobe and decided I needed to get out of that room for a while. I grabbed my jacket and headed downstairs to the lobby, but the receptionist was gone. The place was deserted, eerily silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. When I returned to my room, I found the door ajar. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I stepped inside cautiously, looking around for any signs of an intruder, but nothing seemed out of place, except for the wardrobe. The door was wide open now, and the mirror was fogged up, like someone had been breathing on it. I stood there, frozen, staring at my own reflection, when I noticed something written in the fog. Leave. That was it. I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the room, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I drove straight to the nearest motel and didn't look back. The next morning, I called the hotel to explain why I'd left so suddenly. The receptionist wasn't the same woman I'd spoken to before. This one was younger, friendlier. When I told her about the wardrobe, she went silent. "You stayed in room 207, she asked, her voice shaky. "Yeah." "Why?" She hesitated before saying, "That room hasn't been rented out in years." I hung up and never called back. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that room, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never stay in a hotel without checking the reviews again. If you're feeling a chill running down your spine right now, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any more of these terrifying tales. Story 5, The Basement. Okay, let me tell you something, this one still gets to me. And every time I think back to it, it feels like it just happened yesterday. It was like a nightmare come to life, and it all started when my family moved into that house, an old house, the kind you just know has a story. It wasn't anything special at first, but there was one thing about it that immediately caught my attention, the basement. You know how some houses just have that feeling? Like you walk in and something feels off. That's what I got from this house right away. The house itself wasn't huge or anything. A nice, two-story with a spacious backyard, a little garden in the back, and a decent-sized kitchen. But every time I walked past that basement door, something pulled at my gut, warning me to stay away. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't the fact that the basement was dark and musty, or that it was hard to even get the door to open without hearing that creak sound, it was something more. Something alive down there. Something waiting. I wish I'd listened to that feeling. But of course, I didn't. We were in the middle of unpacking, and it was just one of those things that got pushed to the back of my mind. That is, until my dad decided it was time to clean out the basement. I remember it clearly, one Saturday morning, after a couple of weeks of settling in, my dad walked into the living room holding a crowbar. He had that "let's get to work" look on his face. "We need to clean out the basement," he said. It was probably full of junk the old owners left behind. I didn't want to go at first, but he insisted. So, reluctantly, I grabbed a flashlight, and we both went down there. Now, when I opened that door, it was like a chill hit me, like stepping into a whole new world. I don't know if you've ever been in a place that feels wrong from the second you step foot inside, but that's exactly how the basement felt. The air was thick, almost wet, and the light down there flickered as if it was on the verge of giving out. It didn't help that the walls were covered with cobwebs and dust, the floor creaked beneath our feet like it hadn't been walked on in years. The whole place felt forgotten, like time had just stopped down there. At first, we just started sorting through things, moving boxes around. There were old things, old furniture, rusted tools, and just piles of stuff. But there was one thing that caught my eye, and it was something I still can't explain to this day. It was a box, old, wooden, with these strange carvings on the side. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the basement, almost like it was deliberately hidden. And when I say it was hidden, I mean it was buried under piles of old furniture and boxes. The rest of the place was cluttered, sure, but this box was tucked away in a space that felt intentional. My gut told me not to touch it, but curiosity got the best of me. I bent down, wiped the dust off the top of the box, and as I did, I felt a cold draft sweep across the back of my neck. I froze for a second, but then I shook it off. I figured it was just the basement's weird temperature. But that cold feeling didn't go away. It lingered. When I opened the box, my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. The first thing I saw was a small, tarnished key. A key that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Alongside it were several old coins from a time period I didn't recognize. And there was something else, a book. A leather-bound book, with strange symbols etched into its cover. The moment I saw it, my heart skipped a beat. There was something wrong about it. The symbols weren't anything I had ever seen, and the leather was unnervingly cold to the touch. I pulled the book out slowly, trying not to make too much noise. I felt like I shouldn't be looking at it, like there was a reason it was hidden away in the first place. But I couldn't help myself. I opened it. And that's when everything started to change. The moment I flipped the first page, the air in the room changed. I'm talking about a sudden drop in temperature, so sudden that I could see my breath. You could hear it in the silence, too, like the walls themselves were creaking, groaning under some unseen weight. The house suddenly felt heavier, like it was sinking into the earth. And as I kept reading, I could feel the words pulling me in deeper. It wasn't just the book, it was something else. The air thickened. The shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to stretch and move, creeping toward me. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was all in my head, that it was just my imagination. But then, I heard it. A soft sound, like footsteps, echoing through the basement. Slow. Deliberate. It wasn't my dad. He was still upstairs, calling for me to hurry up. No one was down there with me. I dropped the book, and that's when the lights flickered. Not just flickered, they went out completely, plunging the entire basement into pitch black. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in total darkness, but let me tell you, it's terrifying. You can't see your hand in front of your face. And in that moment, I could feel something, someone, standing behind me. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was there. I could feel it in my bones. A presence. Cold. Dead. Then, there was a soft whisper. It came from behind me, so close that I could almost feel the breath on my ear. The whisper was unintelligible, but it didn't matter. The sensation it left. Pure dread. I was frozen. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't move. The footsteps continued, slow, methodical. Closer. Closer. I don't know how I found the courage, but somehow, I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it in the direction of the noise. The beam of light illuminated the basement, revealing nothing. Just old furniture and boxes. But the moment my eyes left the flashlight beam, I swear I saw something moving in the shadows. That's when I heard my dad shout from upstairs, breaking the silence. I didn't even wait to hear the rest. I ran up those basement stairs like my life depended on it, slammed the door shut behind me, and didn't look back. Later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, something watching. But that's not even the worst part. A few days later, after we'd moved a bunch of things out of the basement, I noticed the door to the basement was cracked open. I was sure I had closed it. I know I had. But when I stepped closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the wood of the door, were deep, long scratches. Like something had tried to claw its way out. I wish I could say I just moved on. I wish I could say it was just a weird experience and nothing more. But I couldn't. That house never felt the same again. I kept hearing whispers, voices calling me down to the basement, and every time I passed by that door, the air felt colder. Eventually, my family moved out. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't live in a house where something, or someone, was trapped in the basement, waiting to get out. I haven't gone near that place since. And every time I think about it, I can't help but wonder if that book, that key, and whatever else was down there, maybe it's still waiting for someone to open the door again. If you're feeling a chill running down your spine right now, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any more of these terrifying tales. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Story 6, The Haunted Mirror. Alright, this next one is one that still haunts me to this day. I remember it like it happened just yesterday, and I'll never forget that damn mirror. It all started when I bought this second-hand mirror. Nothing extravagant, just a big, vintage mirror I thought would look great in my hallway. You know how it is, sometimes you just come across something in a thrift shop that you can't resist. It wasn't expensive at all, just an old, tarnished piece, but for some reason, it felt like I was meant to find it. Now, I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or haunted objects. I always thought it was just people's imagination running wild, or maybe the way a room looks or feels that gets to your mind. But this mirror changed everything. I brought it home, cleaned it up, and placed it right where I thought it would fit best, hanging on the wall of my hallway. It added some character to the place, and honestly, I thought it looked pretty good. I even admired it a few times while walking by, thinking to myself how lucky I was to have found such a nice piece. But then, something strange started happening. It wasn't immediately obvious, but over time, I noticed something off when I walked past that mirror. The reflection. It didn't always look like it was mine. Now, before you get any ideas, let me clarify, I wasn't hallucinating or anything. But sometimes, when I glanced at my reflection, it seemed delayed. Like my movements were in sync with the mirror at first, but then they weren't. There was this slight lag. Like I'd move, and then a split second later, the reflection would follow. At first, I just shrugged it off as a trick of the light or the way the mirror was positioned. Maybe the angle was off, causing this weird visual effect. But then, things started getting more intense. I was sitting in the living room one evening, watching TV, when I noticed a shadow in the corner of my eye, right next to the mirror. I turned my head, and for a second, I could have sworn I saw someone standing there. I jumped up, heart racing, but when I looked again, the hallway was empty. Nothing there. Just the mirror, reflecting the empty space in front of it. I convinced myself it was just the light playing tricks. You know how shadows can move when you least expect it, right? But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I kept hearing faint whispers. Low voices, like a conversation happening just outside my bedroom door. Every now and then, I'd hear a soft tap, like fingernails tapping on the mirror, but when I checked, there was nothing there. The whispering continued for days. It was subtle at first, but over time, it grew more distinct. The voices were clearer, more urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was like they were coming from the direction of the mirror. One night, after hours of tossing and turning in bed, I decided to investigate. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to ignore the creepy feeling crawling up my spine. And that's when I saw it. Just out of the corner of my eye, someone else in the reflection. Someone who wasn't there. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light. Maybe my tired mind was playing games with me. But no, when I turned my head to look, the person in the mirror didn't move. They stayed there, just standing in the background, watching me. And it wasn't my reflection. It wasn't like I could just tell because of the angle or some visual distortion. The person in the mirror looked different. Their clothes weren't the same as mine, and their face was completely unfamiliar. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I had to blink a few times, thinking maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but the figure didn't disappear. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, and the longer I stared, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The person in the mirror, they smiled. A slow, twisted smile that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I felt a coldness rush over me, and that's when I heard the whispering again. This time, the voices were clearer, almost like they were speaking directly to me. I could feel the words vibrating in my skull, as though they were inside my mind. You shouldn't have touched it. I didn't know what to do. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the mirror. And when I finally turned around and ran out of the room, I could still feel that cold presence following me. That thing in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something trapped, something hungry. The next day, I decided it was time to get rid of the mirror. I couldn't keep living with that thing in my house. But as soon as I tried to move it, I noticed something even more disturbing. The mirror, which had always been hung perfectly level, was now tilted slightly to the side. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to straighten it out. I took it down, wrapped it in a blanket, and shoved it in the garage. I thought that would be the end of it, but that night, the voices came back, louder this time, clearer. And I realized, they weren't coming from the mirror anymore. I started hearing the whispers from all corners of the house. I could hear them in the living room, in the kitchen, and even in my bedroom. Every night, the sound got worse, the voices more frantic. And no matter where I went, I felt that cold presence following me. It was like something was inside the walls, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. I tried to get rid of the mirror by throwing it out, but every time I took it to the dumpster, it would show up back in the garage by the next morning. I couldn't escape it. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. At this point, I had no idea what to do. I started researching the history of the mirror, hoping there was some explanation for the weird things happening. I found out that it had once belonged to an old family, a family that had lived in the house before I did. The story goes that the family had been cursed, their home haunted by a dark spirit that had taken over the mirror. The family was said to have disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving only the mirror behind. I knew at that point that I had to destroy it, destroy whatever was holding the spirit trapped inside. So, I did what anyone in my situation would do. I took the mirror out to the woods and smashed it with a sledgehammer, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces. For the first time in weeks, the whispers stopped. But let me tell you, even after all that, I still feel its presence sometimes. Every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, and I swear I see a face, just for a split second. It's like that mirror, whatever was inside it, still hasn't let go. And every time it happens, I'm reminded that some things aren't meant to be messed with. If you're still feeling that chill creeping up your spine, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming up next. Stay tuned for more spine-tingling tales. Story 7, The Shadow in the Mirror. Have you ever had a moment when you looked into a mirror, and for just a split second, you thought you saw something else staring back at you? Something that wasn't you. Something wrong. That happened to me one night. And to this day, I still can't explain it. It was one of those experiences that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. If you've ever had that eerie feeling that something in your life is just off, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. This story starts on an ordinary evening. It wasn't anything special. I was just at home, alone, relaxing after a long day. It was one of those nights when you just want to unwind, take a shower, maybe grab a quick bite to eat, and zone out with a movie or some music. You know the kind of night I'm talking about, the kind where everything feels calm and predictable. Or at least that's how it started. I had just finished a long day of work and was getting ready for bed. My apartment wasn't huge, but it was cozy. Just a small living room with a couch, a little kitchenette, and a bathroom tucked at the back of the place. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. The bathroom had a full-length mirror on the door, right across from the sink. You know, the kind of mirror that you look into when you're washing your hands, brushing your teeth, or just taking a glance at yourself. Now, I've used that mirror 1,000 times before, and I never gave it a second thought. But this time, it was different. I just stepped out of the shower, drying off, and as usual, I walked over to the mirror to check myself out, mostly just to see if I'd missed any spots while shaving. I was still a little foggy from the steam, but I did what anyone does, I looked into the mirror. But this time, when I looked up, something changed. For a moment, I thought it was just the steam messing with my vision, but as I focused, I realized something wasn't right. There was a figure standing behind me, in the reflection. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there. The bathroom was empty, just me. I stared at the empty room, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I laughed to myself, thinking I was just imagining things. It had been a long day, and maybe the steam had made me see things. But when I looked back into the mirror, there it was again. The figure. This time, it was clearer. A shadowy outline, almost like a person, standing behind me in the reflection. It wasn't like it was a solid figure, though. It was distorted. The edges of it were blurry, as if the person was trying to step out of the mirror itself, but couldn't quite manage to cross over. The figure seemed to be watching me. I froze. I don't think I'd ever felt my heart race that fast in my life. This wasn't just some trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. No, this was something different. Something I couldn't explain. I reached out and wiped my hand across the mirror, clearing away the steam, hoping it would just be gone. But it wasn't. The figure didn't vanish. Instead, it got closer. With every blink, it seemed to step forward, getting nearer and nearer until it was practically breathing down my neck. I could almost feel it there, even though I knew there was no one behind me. The reflection was alive with movement now, the shape growing more distinct. It was tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. The thing, whatever it wasn't human. I couldn't tell if it was a man, a woman, or something else entirely. But it wasn't something I wanted to be around. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't scream, I could barely move. It was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in this moment, with the figure staring right at me, even though I could feel that my own eyes were wide in terror. But the most disturbing part. The reflection in the mirror wasn't showing the fear I felt. It was calm. Almost peaceful. The figure's face, though unclear, had a kind of serenity to it that was totally out of place. It was like the figure was inviting me to come closer. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at that figure in the mirror. Seconds. Minutes. It felt like hours. But eventually, I gathered the courage to turn around again, convinced I was just imagining things, that the figure would be gone when I looked away. But it wasn't. It was still there. Right behind me. It was almost like a game now. I would turn my head, and the figure would turn with me, moving perfectly in sync. And each time, the closer it got. I could feel its cold presence in the room, creeping up behind me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever was there. But something kept drawing me back to that mirror. I tried to leave the bathroom, to walk away from it, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if the mirror had some kind of hold on me. I couldn't even tear my eyes away from it. My reflection, still calm and serene, seemed to be holding me there, daring me to do something, anything. But I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. No way. I turned and ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. My pulse was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. I thought about calling someone, telling them what happened, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Who would believe me? I didn't even believe it myself, not fully. I stayed out of the bathroom the entire night, and even the next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look at the mirror again. I didn't want to. I was afraid that if I did, the figure would be waiting for me again. And in some strange way, I think it was. But I couldn't be sure. The odd thing was, after a few days, it started to feel like it never happened. Like it was just a bad dream, a hallucination. I tried to forget about it. I thought maybe I was just tired, maybe it was stress or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. And every time I walked past that mirror, I'd catch myself glancing at it, half expecting the shadow to reappear. It didn't. Not for a while. But even now, when I look into a mirror, there's a small part of me that wonders if it will be there, watching. Waiting. So, if you're ever alone, and you find yourself in front of a mirror, take a moment to really look at your reflection. And if you see something else staring back at you, something that doesn't belong, maybe think twice about what you do next. Because sometimes, the things we see in mirrors aren't just reflections. Sometimes, there's something more. Thanks for sticking with me through that intense tale. If you found yourself looking over your shoulder after hearing that story, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Trust me, you're going to want to hear what's coming next, and you won't want to be alone when you do. Story 8, The Forgotten Village. Alright, let me take you back to a time when I was out driving through the countryside, alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful drive, just me, the open road, and the kind of quiet that you only get when you're far from the city. I'd heard about this village, tucked away somewhere off the beaten path. People would mention it, but no one ever seemed to really know about it. They'd say things like, "Oh, it's a ghost town now," or, "You won't find it unless you're looking for it." Naturally, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided I had to see it for myself. I didn't expect anything strange, at least not at first. It just sounded like one of those forgotten places, you know. The kind where old houses crumble and the streets are left empty, like they've been abandoned for decades. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that this place was far more than that. It all started innocently enough. I was driving, looking for a sign of the village, when I finally saw it, a small, faded sign barely visible among the trees, reading, "Welcome to Millersfield." There was something off about it, but I didn't think much of it. I turned down the narrow, overgrown road, and the further I went, the more the world seemed to change. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches hanging low, as though they were trying to block me from going any further. The village came into view not long after that. It was small, just a few dilapidated buildings standing eerily still in the fading daylight. The windows of the houses were dark, like no one had lived there for a very long time. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy. The streets were empty, and not a single soul was in sight. There were no birds, no wind, nothing. It was silent, and the silence was deafening. As I parked the car and stepped out, I felt a strange weight in the air. It wasn't just the silence. There was a heaviness. Like the village was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. I started walking through the main street, my boots crunching on the overgrown grass and gravel. It looked like time had stopped here. There were old, rusted cars parked along the roadside, their paint peeling, wheels sunk into the dirt. The doors of the houses were slightly ajar, as if inviting me to take a look inside. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself drawn to one of the houses. I approached the front door and pushed it open. The hinges squeaked loudly in the silence, and inside was like a scene frozen in time. There were dishes on the table, covered in dust. A fireplace in the corner, cold and dark. Old furniture covered in white sheets. But there was something more disturbing, something that gave me chills. It was the photos. Scattered across the walls were pictures of the people who had lived there, frozen in happy moments, smiling at the camera. But their faces, their eyes, they didn't look right. They looked empty. Hollow. Like their smiles weren't real. I could feel my skin crawl as I stared at them, unable to tear my eyes away. It was like they were staring back at me. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a low, dragging noise from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I froze for a second, wondering if maybe there was someone else here, someone who had been living in this forgotten place, hiding from the world. Slowly, I moved toward the stairs, my feet moving as if they were guided by something beyond my control. The closer I got to the top of the stairs, the louder the dragging noise became. It sounded like someone, or something, was dragging itself across the floor. It was slow, agonizing, like it didn't have the strength to move any faster. I reached the top and found the hallway dark and narrow. The air felt colder up here, and that oppressive weight seemed to grow heavier with every step I took. The noise was louder now, coming from a door at the far end of the hall. I could see a faint light shining under the door, and my curiosity got the better of me again. I pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. And there, in the corner, was a figure, hunched over, dragging itself across the floor. It was a person, or at least it looked like one at first. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could see it wasn't quite human. The skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were just like the ones in the pictures downstairs, hollow, empty, lifeless. It turned to face me, and I swear, for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes. Like it knew me. Like it had been waiting for me. Before I could react, the figure let out a low, guttural moan, and the room went completely still. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I had to get out. And fast. I ran back down the stairs, through the front door, and out into the street, barely stopping to check my surroundings. The silence was unbearable now. As I sped away, the village behind me seemed to vanish, like it was slipping back into the fog of forgotten time, taking its secrets with it. To this day, I wonder what I really saw in Millersfield. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something more sinister lurking in that village, something that doesn't want to be found? Story 9, The Unwanted Guest. Let me tell you about a time when I had to deal with a guest, an unwanted guest. It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening where everything feels just right. You know the type, right? The house is quiet, the lights are dim, and the evening feels almost peaceful. I had just finished a long day and was ready to settle in for a relaxing night. I even made myself a cup of tea, took a deep breath, and plopped down on the couch with my favorite book. That was when I heard it. A knock at the door. Now, I wasn't expecting anyone. In fact, I hadn't had visitors for weeks, so it was a little strange that someone would show up out of nowhere. But I got up, curious nonetheless, and went to answer it. I opened the door and found no one there. Just a gust of wind blowing through the crack, but there was something odd about it. A chill ran through me as if the air itself had gotten colder. I closed the door and shrugged it off, thinking it was just the wind playing tricks. But then, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder. More insistent. 3 knocks, then a pause, and then another 3. I was starting to get frustrated. Who was out there? I opened the door once more, ready to confront whoever was causing this nuisance. But again, no one was there. I was about to shut the door when I noticed something on the ground. A small package, wrapped in brown paper, just sitting there on my doorstep. It had no label, no return address, nothing to explain who had left it. Now, this is where things got strange. You see, I never ordered anything. I wasn't expecting any deliveries. I hesitated for a moment. Should I open it? Should I leave it? But my curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. It was light, almost weightless, and as I held it in my hands, I could feel something odd. Like there was energy emanating from the package. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the package. I knew I shouldn't open it. Something told me it wasn't meant for me. But I couldn't help myself. I unwrapped it, carefully peeling back the paper, and inside was a small, old-fashioned wooden box. It looked ancient, weathered, and the wood was dark and cracked. It was beautiful, in a way, but something about it made my skin crawl. There was a small latch on the front of the box, and I could feel the weight of it, like it was calling me to open it. I reached for the latch and snapped it open. Inside the box was a note, and beneath it, a single black feather. The note was handwritten in a delicate script, but the words sent chills down my spine. You have been chosen. Do not ignore your fate. And just like that, everything in the room went cold. The lights flickered, and I could hear a faint whisper in the air, coming from nowhere. The feather moved. I swear, it moved. I tried to close the box, but it wouldn't shut. Something was holding it open, as if an invisible force was stopping me from closing it. That's when I realized that this wasn't just a package. It was an invitation. An invitation to something far darker than I could ever imagine. And from that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. And no matter how many locks I put on the door, no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the knocking would never stop. Sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that start in the most innocent of places. Whether it's a forgotten village, an unwanted guest, or the unexplained knock on the door, these tales remind us that the unknown is closer than we think. And it's always waiting for the right moment to find us. Which story haunted you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more terrifying tales, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, stay cautious, because the shadows are never far behind.